In 2023, the people of Ecuador voted 59% to 41% in a national referendum to stop exploiting oil in the Yasuní region, one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, despite the billions to be earned from doing so. It was a huge break with the status quo in a year when fossil fuel use around the world reached record highs and profits soared. So how did it happen? And what lessons can the rest of the world learn from Ecuador? Here to answer these questions and many more is Andrés Arauz, a senior fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research and formerly a politician in the Ecuadorian government. I spoke to Andrés about Ecuador's pursuit of climate and environmental justice, as well as the barriers facing lower-income countries in the context of a highly unequal global economy. From the International Monetary Fund to international trade, Andrés unpacks the ways that injustice is built into global capitalism and lays out a blueprint for a radically better alternative. I'm Adrienne Buller, and you're listening to The Breakdown. Andrés, thank you so much for joining us on The Breakdown.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
At one point, your title was Deputy Minister, and I might get this wrong because it's translated, but for the planning of Buen Vivir, which is a concept I find really interesting when it comes to how we should be thinking about climate and ecological crisis. So I'd love if you could just sort of introduce us to that idea and sort of what it means within the kind of Ecuadorian constitution and how it informs your approach to climate and ecological crisis.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I guess the easiest way to understand this is to think in reference to the U.S. Constitution. So you have the pursuit, the right of the pursuit of happiness, and some would say that's kind of abstract. Well, Buen Vivir is abstract, but then also concrete. In our constitution, our utopia, our horizon, where we're going to strive for, is Buen Vivir, which means to live well, a good life, good living. And we have a series of articles in our constitution that explain what that's about. And basically, we're talking about human rights, economic, social, cultural, environmental human rights, the rights of nature, how we interact and relate among humans, but also between humans and non-human life, and humans and our environment and nature and so on. So it's a harmonious system, but that, you know, after you have the nice sort of philosophical agreement that that's our utopia, okay, how do we make this happen in reality? And that's why we had a very strong planning department in the Republic of Ecuador. And the planning department had one of the deputy areas, which was mine, which was, okay, make this happen. So my job was to take the concept, take the human rights, and then plan how to reach them in terms of resources, but in terms of a material base to actually make this happen. And then the conclusion was, okay, we need productive transformation. You can't have universal everything, health, education, good roads and everything, without having a strong economy. And a strong economy means industrialized economy, but not replicating the patterns of something that's not ours, but trying to find our own path and also our own horizon. So it was a beautiful job, and we decided to stick to planning tools that were long-term in vision, and that would incorporate what we call biophysical metrics. So basically, instead of measuring everything in dollar terms, we decided to measure things in joules, in kilometers, in energy flows, and material flows, and so on, so that we would have something concrete to relate to in real terms as to how we would achieve our goals. Yeah.
And to pick up on the point there about sort of having that economic base, something that's been, I guess, quite a significant part of Ecuador's economic development has been oil, and quite a complex relationship, I think, to the exploitation of oil, culminating last year in the referendum to sort of keep oil in the ground in Yasuní, after quite a long sort of decade of various sort of false starts on trying to achieve that sort of historic event. But I'd love if you could just sort of unpack for us, what is the relationship, I guess, between oil and ideas of sort of economic development for Ecuador? Because I think, for so many countries, there's this kind of tension, quite unfairly, I think, thrust upon their governments between this association of like extractivism being attached to kind of growth and all of the,
important goals like poverty alleviation and the sort of trade-off that imposes with climate and environmental goals. So could you just sort of speak a little bit about how you think about that in the Ecuadorian context?
Yeah, absolutely. But together I have to explain how these biophysical goals, for example, we want food sovereignty. So we want to have enough food to feed our own population without relying or being dependent on imports. But in the meantime, you still need fertilizers, right? But fertilizers are not produced in Ecuador. So you need dollars to purchase those fertilizers in the world market. How do you get those dollars? Well, first you have to export something to get those dollars. Now, what do you export? Let's see what I have. I can sell my body, I can sell nature, I can make goods or whatever. And what we have on hand is, for now, because of our low industrial level, raw materials, including, of course, crude oil. So when the Yasuní initiative was proposed by the Ecuadorian government initially, it said, look, we have these huge reserves in the middle of a park with huge biodiversity, one of the hotspots of biodiversity in the planet. We really don't want to extract that oil and then sell it, but we still need the money though. So why don't we get some compensation from the rich countries for not extracting that oil and for not releasing those emissions into the atmosphere? Of course, we had no support from the rich countries. So then the government had to face a decision, which I call, what you call the tension, a tension between two forms of ethical behavior. One is called the ethics of principles, so sticking to your principles and your ideas no matter what. And the other is called the ethics of responsibility. Say, okay, but I do need fertilizers for my food sector. I need the dollars. I'm going to have to sell the crude to get the dollars because I don't want to then face a food crisis. So you have to balance these two delicately to achieve general well-being. And that's what happened. The government made a decision to then proceed with the extraction of oil. But a large part of the Ecuadorian youth that were enthusiastic about this idea of keeping the oil underground said, no, we want to keep it underground because we have the ethics of principles. And they proposed a referendum that was basically suppressed for a long time until finally last year the vote happened, and over half of the population voted in favor of keeping the oil underground. Now that's a sovereign decision, a referendum. It's binding for us, and now we'll see how that plays out in terms of the current government, which is a right-wing conservative government, whether it complies or not with the popular mandate. Yeah.
And one of the other areas where Ecuador has been sort of incredibly bold is in the decision not to participate and to abandon, in fact, bilateral treaties for trade and investment that involved the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which is a bit of a mouthful, ISDS. And we had a conversation, I believe, in episode 6 of this series with Katerina Pistor about this, so anyone who has seen that episode will have a little bit of familiarity. Highly recommend going back to listen to it. But it would be great if you could speak about what that system is, how it works, and sort of its impacts on a country like Ecuador, and what is the kind of motivation, although it may seem very obvious to you, to sort of to leave that behind and to sort of step out of that system of trade.
Right. So ISDS or arbitration, international investment arbitration, is a really perverse system because basically what it does is it's public international law, so it's a treaty, it's been agreed by the countries and so on, but it allows not countries, but corporations of foreign countries to sue the host country where they have supposedly invested in that country. But the country itself, the state, the government, cannot sue the company if there's any wrongdoing. It's a one-way mechanism to sue. And only capital, only the transnational corporation can sue the government and not the other way around. So it's very asymmetric. It's one way, it's unidirectional, it's colonial, right? And of course, that is not compliant with the rest of our constitutional design, where we say the state has a role to regulate, to tax, to establish standards, and so forth. And of course, if the company under the system feels that they have lost profits because of measures taken by the government, they say, oh, you affected my expectations of profit. Therefore, that's called an indirect expropriation, and they can thus sue the country. And they don't sue them in local courts, where you would think, oh, there's public pressure, there's precedents, there's history. No, they sue them at the World Bank. By the way, the World Bank has its own court system within it called the ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, where they assign case-by-case arbitrators that they pay not as full-time judges, but they have side jobs as lawyers for the firms and so on. And they're like, come here, be my arbitrator. And then they decide what happens. Of course, it's a very well thought out system from the perspective of transnational capital, but absolutely perverse for the interests of countries like ours. So Ecuador, under the 2008 constitution of Buen Vivir, decided to quit all that system. First they quit ICSID, then a bunch of these treaties that mention ICSID, and finally treaties with the big powers, China, US, Europe, where we had those agreements, and Ecuador left the system altogether. The impact initially was, a bit of a diplomatic tension, but eventually the investment continued to flow. Why? Because Ecuador has the natural resources. They have the mines, they have the oil, and so the companies would continue still to invest. So there was no major economic setback. Now, you mentioned the referendum this year. In April, the current government, which is a conservative government in power, proposed a referendum along with 10 other questions. And one of them was, do we want ISDS back? So do we want to allow arbitration so that transnational corporations can sue our country? And the question was camouflaged between 10 other questions relating to crime measures and stuff like that. So the expectation was that the government would get approval of all of the referendum questions, because who understands ISDS anyway? So few people in the world understand it, and how come a general population tried to understand these complex concepts? Well, they did. While Noboa, the current president, won basically all the other questions, the people voted against his initiative to favor ISDS, and there was that and another question where we won, with a popular organization, civil society, and a lot of efforts in terms of social media and digital media. So we're very proud that the Ecuadorian people, were very firm in saying we do not want that system that does not allow for an ecological transition, that does not allow for state regulation of transnational capital.
And can you give an example of what that might look like? What could kind of be the impact if that referendum question had failed, for example?
So the examples we gave when we were campaigning for this was precisely the president's own companies. So, the president right now is the son of a banana mogul, one of the richest persons in Ecuador. And they have banana companies and shipping companies and so forth. And we looked into those companies, and how they are registered in the Ecuadorian system is not as domestic companies. They're registered as foreign direct investment because they were created in offshore structures in British Virgin Islands, Panama, and so forth. So we said, look, this is exactly what they want ISDS for. They don't pay their taxes, and then because they're foreign investment, can sue the country to avoid paying taxes now. So people understood that pretty well. The phenomenon, technically, it's called round tripping, investment round tripping. And people were like, okay, no, we're not going to allow the president to have this way to evade taxes and then sue his own country. And we had another case, which was a mining case, likewise. It was supposedly a Canadian company, but once you go into the Canadian filing records, that Canadian company was really owned by the president's aunt. So again, we have this issue of round tripping where we say, they disguise themselves as foreign firms, but it's really domestic capital with conflicts of interest. So that's how we explain to people that They just wanted to exploit the system to continue extracting rent from the Ecuadorian people.
Right. And one of the things that is your sort of area of expertise in your sort of other wheelhouse as an economist is global financial institutions, so the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. And for the benefit of listeners, just to start out, could you just give us sort of a crash course, a whirlwind tour of, what those institutions really are in terms of, how they function to uphold certain kind of dynamics and inequalities and structures in the global economy? And again, sort of drawing on the Ecuadorian experience as an example.
Sure. I mean, in 1944, were two institutions that were created right before the end of the World War II. It was the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, both based in DC, which was not a coincidence. It was because the United States had veto power in both institutions. So the structure of voting is not one country, one vote. It's actually, the richer countries have more votes. So the richest of them all was at the time the United States, and it has until now, 80 years later, when the world has radically changed, still has veto power of the decisions. So it's very important to understand, because when we talk about the IMF and the World Bank, we're really, really talking about basically extensions of the United States government and the Treasury Department, who is basically the people that are running the show. Okay, now, these entities establish sort of the good practices and how countries should behave in the international monetary system. So when they were created, they said, you can have exchange rates that, you can devalue, you can have them fixed, you have these standards, and you can control or establish regulations for capital movements, but only this much, and you can't touch, issues of trade, you can keep doing trades. So it was like basically the global rules for how a country can behave in terms of their financial and monetary aspect. Now in the 70s and 80s, you had this deregulation and liberalization of the financial system that basically gave more power to big banks around the world than the domestic governments, right? So then it started to change from an entity that coordinated global regulation to an entity that said, don't regulate. It's not necessary. Don't do that. Just allow capital to move in and out and do whatever they want. And so, of course, bankers were really happy. Offshore centers started sprawling up. But at the same time, countries were starting to face debt crises, speculative attacks. Their currencies would lose value. You would have hyperinflation in the economies. People were running into poverty despite not having done anything really. It's like, what did I do? All of a sudden, now I have to face this hyperinflation. Oh, well, your government, on the basis of recommendations of the IMF, opened the capital account and allowed speculators to attack your currency. And all of a sudden, you as a human are facing those costs, and as a productive sector are facing those costs. So after the great financial crisis of 2008, there was a little intent to re-regulate the financial system. And so we've had, those small attempts at re-regulation that have given a little bit of tiny more stability to the system in terms of how it works. Now, the IMF especially operates on the basis of loans. So if a country is in crisis, you need money, right? To pay for your imports, to pay your government workers, to pay for emergencies. And nobody will want to lend to you while you're in the middle of the crisis. There's a saying that bankers are the opposite of umbrellas, right? So when it's not raining, they give you an umbrella. And when it's raining and you need to protect yourself, they're like, oh, give me the umbrella back. And that's exactly how the private financial capital works. So the IMF, in theory, is there to support the countries that are in crisis, but it doesn't work like that. Because the IMF, when the countries are in crisis, says, okay, you're in crisis, so you really need me, huh? So why don't you deregulate some more? Why don't you privatize your state assets? Why don't you start charging for public education and for your public health system? Why don't you start, firing people from the government sector so that you have austerity and can save some money so you can pay me back and so forth. Mm-hmm. So what it does, economics has already shown this time and time again, is it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of more crisis. And then the IMF says, oh, you have more crisis? You need more. And so it comes this infinite loop of austerity and debt crisis that takes sometimes decades for countries to come out of. And depending on the cycles of commodities prices or just good luck, or recently and more generally, outward migration. So you have basically 20%, 10%, 5% of the population that leaves the country, usually to the global north, and then start sending remittances. And it's those dollars that end up saving the economies of the developing world. So the global south countries are aware of this logic, and they say, we need to reform this system. We need to reform the IMF. We need to have a more balanced governance. We don't have to have these crazy conditionalities. We need an entity that's actually there to support us, yes, with technical knowledge, with advisory and so forth, but don't pile on to us. We're in the midst of a crisis.
And one of the things that I learned, embarrassingly actually, quite recently from reading your work is that in addition to the sort of regular interest on loans, that there's something called surcharges that are applied. Could you just talk about what those are and how that works?
So in addition to all this perverse logic, when the IMF gives out the loans, if you are a highly indebted country, they charge even a higher interest when it's supposed to be a solidarity mechanism. No, they punish you even more. Even if you're paying on time, they charge you with these surcharges, which are basically hidden fees that you have as a credit card consumer, right? You have the small print, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, now I have to pay this much to my credit card. That's exactly how surcharges work. When they go to countries, they tell you the headline rate, which is low, really low interest rate, but then when you actually pay the bill, it becomes much higher because of these surcharges. So there's a civil society movement, coalition of countries of the South saying, hey, we need to get rid of these surcharges. It makes no sense to have such a high rate of charge for countries that are already in debt.
Is the idea that the additional surcharges make you more likely to repay how do they possibly justify that?
Oh, they say, because the interest rate is so high, they'll find money wherever so they can pay back early and then try to avoid these costs. But these are countries in crisis. If they had the money, they hadn't requested the loan to begin with, right? So countries, basically have to pay these surcharges because it's not like they can borrow from somewhere else. They don't have access to capital markets or bankers or anywhere. They have low tax revenues and so forth, so they have to pay these surcharges. There's really no option for them.
And could you talk about the system that you've set up there very clearly, what does this do in terms of how countries in the global south are able or not able to respond to and act on sort of climate and ecological crisis, whether that's actually trying to decarbonize or more often to adapt to the impacts of climate change? What is this kind of relationship between this mess of sovereign indebtedness and how countries are free to act?
So the more structural relationship is fairly straightforward. To pay back these loans, you need dollars. How do you find these dollars? Again, you sell your body, you sell your nature. And so that means extractivism. That means, what do I have? I have mines, I have timber, I have, intensive agriculture, or whatever. I'll sell whatever so I can find those dollars to be able to pay these loans, because otherwise I get punished even harder. So these excessive debt fuels extractivism because of the foreign currency pressure, because you have to find these dollars anywhere. And of course, that's the main structural reason. Now, there are more specific, sort of granular reasons that have to do with the policy conditionality. For example, they say, if you want the loan, first you have to privatize your energy sector. And to justify the privatization of your energy sector, you have to stop investing in your energy sector as public investment. And what that creates is basically a weakening of the public sector energy companies and so forth, and it decreases the reliance of society on those companies, and they themselves start to pressure for privatization, right? So it's a well-known recipe. And of course, if you are thinking about these short-term needs, I basically can't turn off the light anymore. then you don't really have the time or the energy or the vision to think about an energy transition when you have to deal with these day-to-day issues of survival. So yeah, and there are many more specific instances on how, for example, World Bank loans are structured in such a way that they're not really solving any of the adaptation issues or the loss and damage issues. There are no reparations embedded into the system either. It becomes a cross-subsidy where poorer countries are actually paying higher interest rates than the rich countries. So it's like a net transfer of wealth from the south to the north. It's like, that's not how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be a multilateral system with solidarity embedded in it, and it's actually not working that way.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned there, which is the idea of loss and damage. And it's sort of always been a very contentious issue in global climate negotiations, and it's now sort of up in the air about exactly what this kind of mechanism we've sort of agreed will be. And so if you were to, we've just outlined quite a few terrible problems with the way that we structure the world economy. So if you were to start with, how loss and damage might work in a way that was actually kind of radical and spoke to the core of the problem, what would that look like from the perspective of the global south?
The concept has to be reparations, basically, right? So, the rich countries got rich by abusing climate, basically, right? And perhaps they didn't know it at the time, but they sure did know that at least since 1992, when the Rio Summit happened, and there was a huge warning to the world that said, hey, climate change is coming, please stop this, and it still continued to happen. So the reparations concept basically means, okay, we're responsible for having emitted all these, this carbon to the atmosphere, and it's warming the planet, and it's creating climate change, but also consequences in terms of natural disasters in mainly the tropics, so global south countries, and therefore the north has a responsibility to compensate or reparate the victims of the climate disaster. That is the main concept that should prevail, which means in accounting terms that the money for loss and damage has to be transfers of wealth, has to be donations, has to be gifts, has to be reparations. But how it's currently designed, it's just a loan. So if you're a country like Pakistan that faced these huge floods, had millions displaced, thousands killed, and the loss and damage fund would say, okay, global north says, okay, we're responsible historically for this, so you can have this money so you can fix it. No. The current system says, oh, I'm sorry about your loss. I'm sorry about the damage. Here's a loan from the IMF to see if you can come out of this, right? In this case, it wasn't set up in the IMF, but set up in the World Bank. But it's kind of the same thing, right? So we don't need more debt. Countries that are undergoing these crises, you don't need more debt. You need transfers of wealth. You need relief. You need help. You don't need a loan shark in the middle of a crisis.
How would you resolve, I guess, the sort of core issues with the way that the IMF functions right now? Is it an institution that in your mind has any redemptive possibilities, or do we kind of need to jettison the way that we kind of organize global finance altogether?
No, I think it has an opportunity at redemption, and we've seen two very clear instances of that actually happening in 2009 and in 2021. In both cases a bit late, but I guess better late than never. And it was the issuance of the special drawing rights. So the special drawing rights, or SDRs for short, were created in 1969 within the IMF to replace gold as an international reserve asset. And it's the closest thing we have in the world to a global currency, right? An SDR, it has no inherent value by itself. It's tied or pegged to a basket of 5 currencies: the US dollar, the British pound, the Chinese renminbi, the Japanese yen, and the euro. And so that's how its value is derived. Now, the SDR is created in a special unit within the IMF that very few people know about, that's called the Special Drawing Rights Department. That has its own balance sheet, independent of the loan area of the IMF. And in this small balance sheet, they create money ex nihilo. That means out of thin air. and then they distribute it or allocate that money to every country in the world that's a member of the IMF. So that's like over 190 countries. And with that money, they can use it for whatever. It's not debt, it's not a loan, it doesn't cost any taxpayers anything. It's resources that are available for the countries that get them. So like, that's good. The IMF should do more of that. It could probably, help them have a much better reputation, especially in the global south. The thing is, to get that decision approved, which usually happened, in big, huge global crises like the pandemic, but you need the vote of the United States because of its veto power at the IMF. So the role of the United States in getting that good side of the IMF to work is absolutely crucial and vital. And of course, we hope that democratic administrations that have been more favorable to SDR issuances make it happen sooner rather than later. In 2020, when we're at the start of the pandemic, Trump vetoed the decision of the IMF to issue the SDRs. But then when Biden came, well, it took Biden another 8 months or so, but at least he did it. He didn't veto, and the US voted in favor of the issuance in 2021. So this is something that we need as a world because we're in the middle of a crisis, and it can be a part of the global relief efforts in the context of debt distress that the countries of the global south are undergoing.
And I just want to end with what will probably be almost too big of a question. But I mean, the kind of divide between North and South in terms of, histories and ongoing systems of massive inequality in terms of contributions to the climate crisis versus, as you pointed out, a historical development of wealth that directly derives from that ecological harm. Where do we begin, I guess, as we look towards ideally trying to build a future that is, not just sustainable, but has some semblance of justice? What would be, the top handful of things that you think really need to change in how we organize the global economy?
Well, I think the first thing we need is to move away from the current metrics, which are exclusively monetary in nature, to go to more real-life variables. We have to be talking to energy engineers, environmental engineers, biologists, and discuss our material flows. And then in the end, after having the conversation of what kind of world we want, not in terms of dollar amounts, but in terms of real life variables, then we can start doing the monetary dimension of that, right? So that means that we have to start putting issues like the climate, like the water crisis, like land use, like energy and so on, in the center of discussion, for example, at the IMF and the World Bank and WTO, which are institutions that were created in the 1940s and are kind of out of sync with the reality of today. The second thing that I would do is, again, reform the accounting of businesses. The US generally accepted accounting principles or the international financial reporting standards are extremely financialized. So they're made and designed in the interests of financial capital, that is, big bankers. When we need to design the accounting, business accounting, income statements, balance sheets, statements, and so forth, in terms of what our goals as humanity are, right? And then the third thing is we need to really give a big push to SDR issuances, right? We need that special unit of the IMF to become a protagonist of climate finance and the energy transition and the climate and green transition in general, with the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities that we have from the Rio Summit in 1992, so that we have a recurrent issuance of this international currency that can help pay for us to get from A to B in terms of the necessary transition in a better world.
Very good plan of action. Got it all sorted out. I think we'll leave it there. Andrés, thank you so much for joining us on The Breakdown.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Breakdown. Our sound and videography are by Ralph Pritchard, and our music is by Thomas Halstead. If visuals are your thing, you can find every episode with video on YouTube or on our website at www.break-down.org, where you can also find essays and other resources from brilliant contributors. Follow us on social media at break_down radio. I'm Adrienne Bowler, thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode.